Ever find yourself staring at a globe, just getting lost in thought about people in those far-off lands and times?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's like a portal to another world, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly what we're doing today, taking a deep dive, you could say, into this really remarkable piece of historical writing.
Ooh, okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
It's John Frampton's 1580 English translation of Francisco Thamra's work,
Okay.
and it gives us this amazing 16th century European perspective of Tartaria,
Tartaria, okay.
which is essentially Central Asia,
Gotcha.
Scythia. Now, that's a historical region. It spanned parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia.
Okay.
And then we also have China, as it was known back then, Cataya.
The Cataya, all right.
So through this text, we get to uncover their perceptions of the customs, social structures, ways of life in these really distant places.
All through the lens of this single incredible source. It's like a time capsule, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, why would a merchant like Frampton take on such a big translation project?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, you see, I think he did it specifically to equip English traders, the ones venturing into these uncharted territories.
Right.
The folks heading out on those 2 recent pinnaces. He even dedicated the work to Roland Hayward and George Barnes.
Oh, wow. Big names in the merchant adventurers.
Exactly. Leaders in that arena.
Right.
And his aim, I think, is pretty clear. It was to give them those essential insights to help them navigate, the potential perils and the commercial opportunities.
Right, like a 16th century doing business abroad guide.
Precisely. Think of it as an early form of market research,
Right.
but filtered through the knowledge of the day.
Yeah, fascinating. So Frampton's essentially providing a synthesized version of Thamra's insights. This Francisco Thamra, we should mention, he was based in Cadiz, Spain,
Right.
and dedicated his compilation of accounts to Don Claris de Guzman, the Earl of Niebla.
Ah, man of connections.
Yeah. What strikes me is Thamra was piecing together this global knowledge,
Right.
about the world beyond Western Europe, the North, Northeast, and East.
All based on, well, what was known or believed at the time. It's history in the making.
Absolutely. And that's really important to remember as we go into this deep dive into these regions. We're not talking firsthand accounts from these authors. They're more like intermediaries.
Yes.
They're translating, compiling information that probably came from various sources, not all of them, well, named or easily verifiable.
Right. It's a bit like a 16th century game of telephone.
Exactly. So we're seeing Tartaria, Scythia, and Cataya through their 16th century European lens.
Right.
With all the biases and potential inaccuracies that come with that.
Yeah.
So our mission, if you will, is to uncover these fascinating details while always keeping that context in mind.
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's start with Tartaria. Our source places it northeast of Europe, bordering Cataya and a region called Salagos to the east.
No.
To the south, we have the Manecos, westward, the Naimanos, and to the north, the Arctic Ocean.
All right. Setting the scene.
Yeah. The name itself, apparently it comes from the Tartar River.
Okay.
The land, well, picture mostly barren, sandy plains. Some areas prone to flooding by rivers. Doesn't sound very hospitable, does it?
Not particularly inviting, no.
Right. And the text says it was sparsely populated with very few cities named. Cricurus is the main one mentioned.
So already we get a sense of this vast, almost empty territory, at least from their point of view, right?
Yeah, totally.
Especially compared to, Europe, where you have settled agriculture and densely packed cities.
Yeah.
The text even points out a lack of wood. They used animal dung for fuel. You can imagine how that would struck a European reader.
Oh, absolutely.
Totally different way of life.
Yeah. And the climate. Don't even get me started.
Oh, tell me about it. Paint me a picture.
It sounds brutal. Summers with thunder and lightning so violent, people could die from fright.
No way.
Yeah. Then, intense heat, followed by, get this, sudden extreme cold and heavy snowfall.
Wow. Talk about extremes.
Yeah. And the wind. Powerful, almost constant.
You'd be holding on for dear life.
Oh, yeah. Strong enough to knock riders off their horses and uproot trees.
Jeez.
Even the rain was weird. Hardly any in summer, none in winter. How could anyone survive there?
That's what I'm thinking. But here's the kicker. Despite those insane conditions, the text says the place was teeming with livestock.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Oxen, camels, horses, particularly horses, and all sorts of working animals.
Wow.
More, they claim, than the rest of the world combined.
So you've got this brutal climate, but an abundance of animals.
Exactly.
What does that tell you?
Well, to me, it screams nomadic pastoral lifestyle. Like
Yeah.
that's how they adapted to these harsh conditions.
Right, so who were these people? The text describes 4 initial groups in Tartaria. The Yeka Mongales, or Great Mongales.
Okay.
Then you have the Sumo Gales, Mongales of the water, the Mercat, and the Metrit.
All right, so 4 distinct groups.
Yeah, but similar appearance and language. Simple herding life at first, influenced by their Scythian neighbors. But things changed. They started having their own captains, leaders, and even paid tribute to the Neymanos.
So we see an evolution in their social and political structure, from a loose herding society influenced by the Scythians to having their own leadership and becoming, like, tributary. That sets the stage for some pretty big power shifts.
Right, and that's where Kangista comes in. This guy's a fascinating character. He rose to become king through an oracle, a divine pronouncement.
Oh, wow. That's a power move.
Yeah.
Talk about a mandate from heaven.
One of his first acts, he abolishes all forms of, quote, devil worship and establishes a new religious order.
A new order, okay.
Worship of one god. They describe him as the mightiest, greatest, best.
Huh.
And Kangista even publicly declares he received his kingdom directly from this god.
Ah, classic strategy. Unify the people under a new belief system. Legitimize his rule. You see that a lot with powerful leaders throughout history.
Totally, but he doesn't stop there.
Okay, what's next?
He reorganizes the army.
Okay.
All the men who could fight into a military hierarchy, from corporals to colonels.
Structure, gotta love structure.
But to really solidify his authority, he does something pretty shocking.
Oh boy, this should be good.
He orders 7 of the most prominent men, powerful figures before his reign, to kill their own sons with their bare hands.
Whoa! Talk about a loyalty test.
And get this, they do it.
No way.
The text attributes this to fear of the common people, and this deep belief that disobeying the king was the same as disobeying God.
That's some serious mind control. It's brutal, but effective. I mean, how do you question someone after that?
Yeah. And with this unchallenged power, Kangista goes on a campaign of expansion. First, he subjugates the Scythians, makes them pay tribute.
Okay.
Then he turns his attention to other nations near and far, and he's successful.
Oh, wow.
So successful, in fact, that he ends up ruling everything from Scythia in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west.
From Central Asia to the Mediterranean, that's a huge chunk of land.
Right, leading him to take the title of Lord and Emperor of the East.
Ambitious guy. And talk about a power shift on the world stage.
Totally. So let's try to picture these Tartars. The text describes them as often tall, with these distinctive eyes.
Okay.
Large, protruding, with very hairy eyelids. Apparently, the eyelids covered a good part of the eye.
Wow.
They had broad faces, sparse beards only growing on their upper lips, slender waists, and long hair, which they wore in 2 rolls behind their ears.
Okay, so a pretty specific image. Makes them easily identifiable.
Right. And get this hairstyle, it became trendy among neighboring peoples, too.
Ah, a little Tartar fashion influence.
Exactly.
Spreading their culture.
Now their lifestyle, expert horsemen. But on foot, not so much. They rarely walked even short distances. Preferred to travel on a horseback or by oxen.
Okay.
Women would ride geldings, thought to be more manageable. Their saddles were often decorated with silver and precious stones. And they took pride in the sound of bells on their harnesses.
So a very mobile, horse-centric culture.
Yeah. Their speech was described as sharp and high-pitched. Singing was more like howling, like wolves, and they had this weird habit of shaking their heads while drinking.
Okay.
Oh, and excessive drinking. That was a sign of honor for them.
Interesting. So you've got the visuals, the sounds, the customs. They would have seemed pretty exotic to Europeans.
Totally. They didn't live in towns or cities, more out in the open fields like the early Scythians. Their homes were tents or shop-like structures, made from branches or timber covered with felt.
All right, so still very nomadic. Makes sense.
Yeah. These structures had a round opening at the top for light and to let the smoke out from the central fire. That's where the family would gather. They were great hunters, too. Armed on horseback, they'd encircle wild animals and bring them down with arrows. Oh, and one more thing. The text says they didn't use tables, cloths, or napkins when they ate.
Definitely a different approach to dining than what Europeans were used to.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk beliefs. They believed in one God, the creator of everything, seen and unseen. But they didn't formally worship him. Instead, they made idols from felt or silk, shaped like humans. They placed them on either side of their tents or homes, believing they would protect their livestock. And they showed real reverence towards these idols, offering the first milk from their animals, a portion of their food and drink. Even when they slaughtered an animal, they kept its heart overnight in a vessel, boiled and ate it in the morning. But they also paid homage and made sacrifices to the sun, moon, the four elements, and their great Cham, whom they considered the son of God.
So it's a blend of like a supreme creator with these more localized practices, idols, natural forces, and veneration of their ruler. That must seem a bit strange to Europeans with their more defined religious traditions.
Yes,
A bit unorthodox, you could say.
the text makes it clear the Tartars believed they were superior in wisdom, in virtue, and this led them to be quite isolationist.
Oh, so they kept to themselves.
Yeah, avoided other nations, didn't really want to interact. They even had names for the Pope and Christians, called them dogs and idolaters because of the Christian veneration of statues and crosses.
Classic clash of cultures, each side judging the other's beliefs. We see that a lot throughout history, unfortunately.
It's a recurring theme. They were also big on what the text calls wicked arts, believed in dreams, employed people skilled in magic and divination.
Okay, so a society with a lot of superstition.
Yeah, they'd consult their idols for guidance, thinking God spoke through them, were very observant of weather patterns, especially the phases of the moon. But here's an interesting thing. They didn't observe any religious festivals, fasting, or abstinence. Same routine year-round.
Huh. So their practices were quite different from other societies, European ones included.
Absolutely.
Now, what about their laws? How do they govern themselves?
Well, when it came to law and order, or maybe their version of it, the Tartars were described as very acquisitive. If they saw something they wanted, that belonged to someone not a Tartar. They'd just take it by force.
Wow, that's pretty bold.
Right. And they cited a decree from King Kangista as justification. This decree also said any Tartar who found a non-Tartar traveling without the king's permission could just claim that person as their property. They practiced really high, compounding usury, charged insane interest rates, and they imposed heavy tribute and oppression on the people they conquered. But they weren't all bad, I guess. They did show hospitality to unexpected guests who arrived during mealtimes.
So it's a system where power and the ruler's word were paramount. And outsiders, well, they didn't have many rights, it seems. The hospitality bit is interesting, though. Shows a bit more nuance to their social custom.
Definitely. Now, their eating habits, let's just say the text describes them as filthy.
Filthy. Oh boy, how so?
They didn't use tables, cloths, or wash their hands, bodies, or clothes regularly. Ate all sorts of animals, including pigs, cats, horses, even rats.
Ooh. Not exactly adhering to European standards of hygiene and cuisine.
Nope. And get this, they had a custom of roasting and eating their enemies, raw. And they would drink their blood, storing it in special vessels. Though their usual drink was animal milk, they did like wine, if they could get it. Oh, and they apparently ate lice, believed it would somehow affect their enemies.
Yikes. That's quite a vivid image. The cannibalism, the blood drinking, definitely paints them as barbaric in the eyes of Europeans. And the lice thing, that's just bizarre.
But here's a twist. They hated wasting food, thought it was bad luck to drop any, and they only slaughtered and ate animals that were old, weak, sick, or injured.
Huh. So resource management was important. Maybe a consequence of their environment and lifestyle.
Right.
You know, waste not, want not.
Yeah. As for clothing, it was pretty standard. Men wore a head covering with a long, span-sized tail down the back. Married women wore a basket-like head garment, about 1.5 feet long, decorated with silk, peacock feathers, gold, and precious stones. Men and women looked pretty similar, apparently. They wore black clothes in summer, white in winter, and the garments usually reached the knee.
So practical clothing, but with some flair, especially for the married women. The similarity between men and women's attire is interesting, too. Again, probably stood out to Europeans used to more gender-specific clothing.
Totally. In warfare, they didn't use lances or longswords much. Preferred short swords and archery on horseback, described as obedient and diligent in battle, fighting without pay to protect and expand their empire. Their captains directed from a distance, shouting warnings and encouragement. They even used tactics like placing their sons' wives and effigies of men on spare horses to make their army seem bigger.
Smart. Deception, a classic military tactic.
A strategic retreat wasn't seen as weakness. They were amazing archers, known for stripping their right arm bare to shoot arrows with such force that no armor could stop them. They'd fight in squadrons, circling their enemies, inflicting these mortal wounds with their arrows, and when they sensed weakness, boom, sudden counterattack, often winning after seeming to retreat at first.
So their tactics were all about speed, archery, deception, perfectly suited to their nomadic, horse-based life. And that discipline, fighting without pay, that shows serious commitment.
Totally. But their victories were marked by incredible cruelty, no mercy to captives, Killed children, women, the elderly, everyone except skilled tradesmen, they took those as slaves. They even had this horrifying practice of hanging one out of every 1,000 dead enemies upside down, like a gruesome warning.
It's a brutal image. Shows just how much terror they inspired in their enemies.
Absolutely. Young captives were enslaved, treated as property.
Right.
Their marriage customs were very liberal, allowed marriage with almost anyone except your mother or daughter, and they practiced polygamy, similar to Saracens and Moors.
Ah, so that's how Europeans categorized them,
Yeah.
by drawing parallels to other non-Christian societies they knew.
Yeah. A wife wasn't considered legitimate until she'd had kids, so barrenness was grounds for divorce and remarriage. But get this, despite having multiple wives, the text says there were no quarrels among them.
Interesting. That would challenge some European stereotypes for sure.
Yeah. Each wife had her own separate dwelling. They were described as chaste, but if caught in adultery, both the man and woman would be killed right then and there. In peacetime, the men focused on herding, hunting, wrestling, while the women handled all the household stuff. Food, clothing, all of it.
Okay, so pretty clear division of labor there.
Yeah,
Men outside, women at home, and adultery. Well, you don't want to mess with that, it seems.
definitely not. They were also very superstitious, particularly about knives and fire. Believed it was bad luck to throw a knife into a fire, touch fire with a knife, even take meat out of a pot with a knife.
Huh. So many rules around everyday objects. It makes you wonder what the deeper meaning behind those beliefs might be.
Yeah. Royal protocol was super strict. Even high-ranking visitors had to go through a purification ritual before seeing the king. And if you had smelly feet or vomited in the emperor's presence, instant death penalty.
Oh, talk about high stakes.
Right. But even with all these rules, the text says they didn't follow Christian commandments, though they did believe in an afterlife where you are rewarded based on your deeds.
Interesting. So their own moral framework, distinct from Christianity, but still with a focus on consequences in the afterlife.
Yeah. And their death rituals, oh boy, those were elaborate.
Okay, tell me about it.
When someone was near death, a lance with a black cloth was placed outside their tent, like a warning to stay away. After death, all the relatives would gather, remove the body, and take it to a designated burial site. They'd build a small cottage made of felt, place a table full of food, and position the body all dressed up, leaning against it. Then they'd cover it with earth.
Okay.
They'd also bury one of the deceased's cattle and a horse fully decked out. Wealthier people might even have a servant buried alive with them to help them in the afterlife.
Wow. Talk about going out in style.
Right. The friends would kill another horse, eat its meat, stuff the skin with hay, and mount it on 4 posts over the grave, like a memorial. Women would burn the bones, believing it purified the soul. For the higher-ups, they'd cut the skin of the deceased into little rings, stretch them around the burial site, and measure the earth, believing the dead person would get as much land in the afterlife as their friends measured with their skin. Mourning usually lasted 20 days.
Wow. That's quite a process. A whole system of beliefs about death and what happens after. And the status thing, too. Even in death, the rich got more.
Totally. Now, the text mentions some Tartars identified as Christians, but their practices were, well, different. They believed in following the wishes of their elders to be put to death sooner when they became old. Then they'd cremate the body.
Okay.
And they carefully collected the ashes and, get this, used them to flavor their food every day.
Whoa. Okay, that's a bit different. A long way from mainstream Christianity.
Yeah, talk about religious syncretism.
Absolutely. Mixing traditions. That happens a lot when a religion spreads to a new place, meets existing cultures.
Okay, how about this for a ceremony? The selection of a new king. All the princes, captains, important men, everyone would gather.
Big event.
The chosen successor, whether by heredity or election, was placed on a golden throne. As soon as he sat down, they'd ask him if he agreed to be their lord and master. And he'd reply that he would, but only if they'd obey his every command, even killing anyone he ordered and surrendering the whole kingdom into his hands. The people would then shout their agreement. Then the bigwigs would take the king off the throne, put him on a felt carpet on the ground, and give a speech, reminding him to look to God and then at the felt, saying if he ruled justly, he'd have everything, but if he messed up, he'd be stripped of everything, even that felt.
A little reminder of his responsibilities, eh?
Yeah. After that, they'd put his favorite wife beside him, lift them both up on the felt, and hail them as emperor and empress. Gifts poured in from everyone. Finally, they'd bring out the dead king's stuff. The new emperor would share some with the princes and keep the rest. And that's it. Everyone goes home, and the new emperor is all-powerful.
Quite a ceremony. Symbolic, but also emphasizing that absolute power.
Right, and the emperor's power was absolute. No one could claim private ownership of land or property. He appointed all the leaders, from captains to corporals. The royal seal even showed God in heaven and the emperor Kikacham on earth. Described as the fortress of God and emperor of all men, he commanded 5 huge armies, each under a principal captain. Foreign ambassadors, they were rare and had to follow strict rules.
Sounds like a very controlled and isolated system.
Yeah, they and their gifts had to be purified before meeting the emperor. And the emperor. He'd talk through intermediaries. The ambassadors, no matter how important, had to stay kneeling the whole time and couldn't change or disagree with anything he said. Even the emperor and princes wouldn't drink in public without music first. When noblemen rode, a hat was carried above them on a lance for shade, and their wives got the same treatment.
So every detail was about reinforcing the emperor's power and prestige.
Now, the text has this interesting bit about the Tartars conquering the Christian Georgians, who followed Greek laws, which probably means Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah.
They were under the Patriarch of Antioch and known for being warriors, even some of the women. Before battle, they'd often drink a whole bottle of wine for courage. But their clergy, they were apparently deep into shady stuff like usury and simony, and they fought with the Armenian Christians. After the Tartars took over, the Georgians supposedly went off the rails, religiously speaking, at least from the Western perspective.
Conquered people, their beliefs often get mixed up with those of their conquerors. Happens all the time.
So, these Georgians, they supposedly weren't sure when exactly Christ was born, didn't really follow holy days or fasting periods. They ate meat on Fridays after Easter and Whitsuntide. Their Lent was super strict. They even thought drinking wine during Lent was worse than sleeping around. They didn't abstain from meat on Sundays, had only one meal on Tuesdays and Thursdays, ate nothing on Wednesdays and Fridays, but ate meat all the time on Saturdays and Sundays. They gave communion to babies as young as 2 months old, kept some Jewish ceremonies. Their priests were into usury and necromancy, and they were all big drinkers. Priests could remarry. Bishops let husbands divorce unfaithful wives and remarry, too. The Georgians themselves admitted they weren't exactly following the correct Christian doctrine, listing 30 specific points.
Wow, they really laid it all out there.
Yeah, it just shows how diverse religious customs were, even within Christianity, and how one group's interpretation could differ wildly from another's.
Absolutely, and how those interpretations could be influenced by conquest and contact with other cultures.
Okay, now let's move on to Scythia.
All right, Scithia, bring it on.
So, according to our source, Scythia is up north, and it gets its name from Scytha. Now, depending on who you believe, he was either the son of Hercules, as Herodotus said, or the son of Ares Prisca, who some think was Noah's wife. That's according to Barolo.
Okay, so already we've got some conflicting origin stories. Classic mythology stuff.
Exactly. At first, the Scythians didn't have a lot of land, but they were known for their courage and strength, and they gradually expanded their territory. From somewhere near the Araxes River, all the way to the Ocean Sea and Lake Maeotis, even up to the Tanais River.
Right, so these guys were warriors, expanding their reach.
Oh, yeah. And tough. The Yamal Mountains split them into 2 groups, the ones inside the mountains and the ones outside. And get this, they were never conquered by any of the big empires. They fought off Darius of Persia, are said to have killed King Cyrus and his entire army, and they even beat one of Alexander the Great's captains. They weren't afraid of the Romans either, apparently. They were hardy people, used to hard work and war.
Serious reputation.
They didn't farm or have permanent homes at first. Lived a nomadic life, roaming the deserts and mountains with their stuff, families, and animals, all packed up in carts.
So a true nomadic culture, adapting to a challenging landscape.
Right. They didn't have written laws, but they believed in justice and fairness. Theft was the worst crime, punished severely, because everyone's property was out in the open.
Makes sense. When your whole life is mobile, you need to protect what you have. Trust is paramount.
Yeah.
What's interesting is the text says they didn't use gold or silver at first. Their main food was milk and honey. Clothes were made from animal skins, even rat skins. Wool and cloth were completely unknown to them. But the text does say these were just general customs and that different Scythian groups probably had their own unique traditions.
So it's important to remember we're getting a simplified view. The reality was probably much more diverse.
Always good to keep that in mind. Now let's get to the less savory aspects. Apparently many Scythians were really into killing, and they had this ritual of drinking the blood of the first enemy they killed in battle.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a gruesome ritual.
They'd take the heads of their victims to their king and get a reward, a share of whatever loot was found on the body.
It's like a trophy system.
Exactly. They'd clean the skull, soften the skin with cowhide, and keep it as a trophy, sometimes even attaching it to their bridles. The more skulls you had, the more badass you were.
Wow.
Some would even sew their enemies' skins together to make coverings, or use the skin from their right hands to cover their quivers. They'd also flay their enemies, stretch their skins on wood, and show them off while riding. They'd even cover skulls in oxhide, gild the inside, and use them as drinking cups, to impress guests and show off their kills. Princes would have these gatherings where everyone drank wine from these skull cups, but if you hadn't killed an enemy and didn't have a cup, you had to drink separately, which was super embarrassing.
That's intense. Talk about a culture that glorifies war.
Definitely. It's a very different perspective on life and death.
Honor.
For sure.
They also had gods they prayed to.
Okay, who were they worshiping?
Their main one was Vesta, then Jupiter, whose wife they thought was Tellus. They also revered Apollo, celestial Venus, Mars, and Hercules. They didn't believe in making images or having temples for any of these gods except for Mars. To him, they'd sacrifice 1 out of every 100 prisoners they took in war.
Interesting. So their gods are, some of them are recognizable from Greek and Roman mythology, but the practices are different.
Right. They also sacrificed other animals, especially horses. But pigs, they hated pigs.
Okay. No bacon for them.
When the king ordered an execution, he'd also have all the condemned person's relatives killed, except usually women and children. And their war treaties, they involved mixing the blood of the allies in a big bowl with wine. Then they'd dip their weapons in it, say curses, and drink it, especially the high-ranking folks.
Blood oaths. That's serious business.
Absolutely.
Symbolizing unity, commitment. You see that in a lot of ancient cultures.
Their royal burials were something else. They'd bury the king near the navigable part of the Borysthenes River. When a king died, they'd dig this huge square hole, take out his insides, clean him up, and fill him with powdered willow branches, thyme, and aniseed, then sew him back up. Then they'd put him on a cart and take him all over the kingdom, and people would cut off their ears and hair and hurt themselves as a way of mourning. After that, they'd bury him with his ancestors in this special burial ground. He'd be laid in a special spot, sealed in with lances, covered with a cloak, and they'd kill and bury his favorite wife, a servant, a cook, a stable hand, a messenger, a page, and a horse with him, along with gold cups and other valuables. A year later, they'd do it again, sacrificing his main servants and 50 horses, arranging the horses around the tomb to look like guards.
Talk about elaborate. It's like they took going out in style to a whole other level.
And all those sacrifices, they really show how important the king's people and possessions were. They believed they'd need them in the afterlife, and the yearly sacrifices. It's like they wanted to keep that connection with the dead king.
Definitely. But for common people, the burials were much simpler. They'd put the body on a cart and take it around to their friends for 40 days, having feasts in their honor.
Oh.
Before burying them, they'd take out the skull, clean it, and put it between 3 pieces of wood with wool hanging on them.
And the women, they didn't wash with water.
What? How do they clean themselves then?
They'd rub a smooth stone soaked in cypress, cedar, or incense all over their bodies. Then they'd cover themselves with oils and stuff, which apparently left them clean and shiny.
Interesting. Talk about a unique beauty routine.
Oaths were a big deal, sworn by the king's hearth. If you broke an oath, which the diviners would figure out, they'd chop your head off and give all your stuff to the people who accused you.
So truthfulness was key.
Mm-hmm.
And the king was the ultimate authority.
Now, let's talk about their neighbors. The Massagetae lived near the Caspian Sea. They were like the Scythians in how they dressed and lived, fighting on horseback and foot using arrows, lances, and short swords. They liked gold belts and headbands and used copper for weapon tips. They didn't have iron or silver themselves, but they could get it easily through trade and stuff. They didn't have a set lifespan, but when someone got old, their relatives would have a party, kill the old person, boil the flesh, and eat it. They thought it was a good and honorable death. If you died from sickness, they buried you. But it was a bad thing because you didn't get the ritual killing.
Wow. Talk about different perspective on aging and death.
They didn't farm, lived off their animals and the fish they caught in the Araxes River. Drank river water mainly. They worshipped the sun and sacrificed horses to it because they were the fastest animals.
So another horse-centered culture.
Yeah.
But that ritual with the elderly, that's pretty unique. Shows a whole other set of beliefs about the cycle of life.
The sources were super peaceful.